content. So, so yeah. So just a little bit about me, just my obligatory about me slide. So I work in Madison, so the commute here was really quick today. So at least I've got that going for me. So I work over at CUNY Mutual on a platform team that helps build out Azure solutions for dev teams. Some of my teammates might be on the call, so thanks for coming. We do a lot of cloud native stuff, and right now, you know, they're teaching me Kubernetes and I'm teaching them C#. So I don't know who's got the better end of the deal. But yeah, I do a lot of community work. I've just kind of been channeling my, you know, writing itch during this pandemic, trying to stay sane. So I write a lot on my site. I've also got a newsletter every week that I push out, interview a lot of great folks. I've got Steve Sanderson interview coming up, the Blazor creator, and a lot of other interesting folks. So if you are interested, feel free to subscribe. So so what is .NET 5? .NET 5 is here. It was released last Tuesday. If you keep up with a lot of the blog posts they send out, if you don't know, big deal, but it's been a release that's been going on and announced like 18 months ago, this whole concept of having one .NET. So, you know, .NET, as I saw, you know, if you look at the meetup invite about this user group that was launched in 2002 when it first came out. 2002 was a different time, right? It was like 5 whole years before the iPhone came out, which changed a lot of things. It was a very Windows-focused environment, right? Steve Ballmer had that famous quote about, you know, never embracing Linux or anything like that. So it was a different time. It was a simpler time. Everything was bound to Windows, and as the web evolved, we had cloud technologies. We had all these different ways to develop, right? So we had Xamarin. When Microsoft wasn't cross-platform yet, they came out with a mono platform. There's a Unity that runs on that as well. There's, you know, ARM64 IoT devices. There's ML.NET now, and for a lot of them, they run on different platforms. So, you know, about 5-6 years ago, when .NET Core came out to be a thinner alternative, cross-platform, supported on Linux and all that stuff, it's great. But then you're also dealing with a lot of different class libraries. You've got .NET Framework, you've got .NET Core, you've got Mono, you've got all these things, and it's very confusing about APIs that aren't supported. So this whole .NET 5 journey is the ability to consolidate repos, to have things like Blazor WebAssembly and regular .NET call the same APIs. Even getting a list in Blazor WebAssembly was formerly, you know, running under Mono, things like that. So it's a, you know, it's providing the ability to unify all that. Some of you who saw the talk title might object to my talk title. You could say that the journey to one .NET comes into shape because with the COVID pandemic, the ability to move Xamarin into the shared .NET ecosystem has been scrapped for .NET 6, which will come out next November. We'll talk about release cycles in a little bit. So I guess if we want to talk more about that, we should say the journey to one .NET becomes reality except for poor Xamarin. So that will be coming next year under a multi-application, it's called MAUI, I believe. So that was the original goal, but I still think after announcing .NET 5 a year and a half ago and facing this terrible pandemic, that they were still able to deliver, with one of the few side effects being that Xamarin is not ready yet. So we are seeing this one .NET come into fruition, even if it isn't complete yet. So when we talk about the transition and what it means to have one .NET, there's often a lot of questions. So first of all, what is .NET 5? I know that the latest .NET Core supported version is .NET Core 3.1. So why don't we just call it .NET 4? What's happening to .NET Framework? What's happening to all the other platforms? So in terms of the transition, there's often a lot of people use the terms dead, meaning not supported, but that's not really true. So .NET Framework 4.8 is the last version of the framework, so it's done. So there's going to be no more features or functionality, just bug fixes, things like that. So it is a core component of Windows. So it will always be bound to Windows, and Microsoft has screamed from the rooftops, as long as they support Windows, they will support .NET Framework. Now, supporting and innovating are two different things. So if you're looking for core improvements to .NET Framework, you will not be getting it, but it will be supported. So .NET Core 3.1 libraries have moved to .NET 5. So the confusion was, with .NET Framework 4.8, we've got .NET 3.1. With Microsoft getting in the habit of, naming things a little inconsistently, they decided, let's just call it .NET 5, and that'll be our new transition. And of course, as I said, the Mono and Xamarin utilities. So Blazor WebAssembly is now running under the .NET 5 libraries, but Xamarin and Unity, things like that under Mono, they will be moving, especially the Xamarin bits will be moving over to .NET 6. So I'm sure you have no questions whatsoever. That makes complete sense, and we can probably end this talk, right? So as I talked about with the state of the .NET framework, so it's done, not dead. By the way, I've got these bit.ly links at the bottom. If while I'm talking you want to pull those up, look at what I'm talking about, that's great. So in this bottom one here, Emma Landworth, a PM on the .NET team, has said, yeah, it's done, not dead. So it's not dead, meaning that it's not supported, it's done. So as I was saying, your apps are safe. .NET Framework 4.8 is the last version. In terms of basically Microsoft saying we're not migrating this stuff, web forms, web forms is dependent on a very heavy and bloated DLL that did not get migrated over, which was rewritten. So their recommendation is to use Razor Pages or Blazor, a nice component framework that we'll be talking about a little bit later. If you've come to enjoy contract services and things like that, then they recommend that you use gRPC, the gRPC protocol, which is, open standards, fast, using protocol buffers and all that. And also with Windows Workflow, when I talked to Madison, one person used it before. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. I've never used it, but the recommendation is to use an open source core WF library for that. So then the next question that you might be asking is, if you're familiar with .NET Framework and .NET Core, there was a specification that was released called .NET Standard. So .NET Standard is a way to tell you, okay, if you are using this version of a .NET Standard spec, then the APIs you're calling will be compatible with all the different kinds of platforms that we're running under. But with .NET kind of merging into a one .NET model, what does that mean exactly? So this specification does help you build a bridge between .NET Framework and .NET Core. So there's not going to be any new versions of .NET Standard. There's going to be a new TFM, a target framework moniker, which is the version that you note in your project files. So the recommendation is to use the following implementation. So if you want to share code with .NET Framework like you do today, you can keep using .NET 2.0, which will be supported. With .NET Standard 2.1, because Mono and Xamarin are not joining the .NET 5 party, that you will target that with 2.1, especially if you're targeting .NET Core 3.0 or 3.1. And of course, if you're using Windows apps or anything like that, there's platform-specific implementations. And for any new greenfield development, anything else moving forward, with the big API set, you can use the new Net 5.0 moniker that will help you get the job done there. So for future state, if you're doing APIs that are supported, then you'll see a Net 5.0 moniker. And then you'll see the Windows one that will apply to Windows apps that you're developing. And then with .NET 6, when Mono and Xamarin join the party, you'll also see Android and iOS flavors and things like that. So any questions at all? Okay, yeah, this is all, it's all it's all been very confusing in the past with the multiple platforms, and I think this is a welcome step. But on the other hand, Microsoft has always been very cognizant of needing to do a lot of backwards compatibility. So that's a way to bridge that. So in terms of the schedule, being a developer in the Microsoft world, it was great seeing that from the .NET Framework to .NET Core, you got away from, having a release, having a new update every 3 years or something, and you were able to see all these updates that they were coming out with. It was a light open source cross-platform release, but they were very inconsistent. So there'd be a lot of breaking changes, and you weren't sure quarter by quarter when a new version would come out and what's supported and what not. And they've definitely heard that loud and clear. So they are planning to release a new full version of .NET every November. So if you look at the diagram here, this shows the last releases that they had, but we've got .NET 5 GA here. That just came out, and then next year you'll have 6.0, and then the year after that it'll be 7.0. They've noted that they're not really planning any minor release cycles, not to say that those won't come out if it's needed, but the goal is to have a predictable schedule here. In terms of the very sexy topic of support for .NET, right? Before we get into the fun stuff, so .NET Core 3.1 is an LTS release, meaning it's supported for 3 years after release, and they are alternating between LTS and current releases. So with .NET 5, it'll be a current release, meaning that it'll be supported up until 3 months after the LTS comes out, and that will be supported for 3 years. So in terms of, after we go through all these features of, you deciding if it's worth it to migrate over, that might be a considerations with companies that value stability and knowing that they may not be updating right away. LTS is an attractive option, but then again, with release cycles every year, you've got from last week, you've got 15 months to use .NET 5 and to migrate over. So just definitely a better model there, and definitely up to you to decide what is best for you. So any questions on any of this stuff before we actually get into the cool developer parts about what's new with .NET 5? Okay, any questions in the chat at all?
There was a question in the chat where they talked about what does a target framework really mean.
Sure.
He said, I get various errors about incompatible version with the NuGet package or components when they pull them in.
Yeah, so you'll see that a lot when you target exact versions. So if I wanted to target something like NET Core 3.1, and you'll see that it's not compatible through various projects, that might be a problem. So a lot of times, it is very common to target something like Net Standard 2.0 or Net Standard 2.1, because that kind of verifies that your APIs are consistent across your libraries and your platform. So I would give that a shot, but we can definitely dig up that URL as well, because I know that that's a common question that we see for sure. Okay, so this is a developer talk, and these are real developers I'm talking to, and I know this because you're here despite the fact that you're not getting free pizza. So that's very exciting. So I know you're here to geek out about this stuff. So obviously I could spend an entire talk about any improvement that they had. There's a lot of great improvements coming with .NET 5. I should stop speaking in future tense now that it's out. But yeah, there's a ton of improvements with, there's ARM64 support on Windows. There's performance improvements with system.text.json, more or less works with serialization. You're likely familiar with Newtonsoft.json. This is actually a faster, more performant version. With .NET 5, you see reports of it being any 2 to 5 times faster. Not to say that Newtonsoft is slow, but my understanding was there were some technical limitations with upgrading that and trying to press a turbo button on that. So definitely a lot of perf improvements. If you look across Twitter or social media, you'll see a lot of people impressed with the memory allocations and the performance improvements with .NET 5 in general. So it's one of those things where you can't show a big cool feature, but if you do some profiling, you can see that that comes a long way. There's a lot of good deployment options, right? So containers are optimized. Click once is still here. There are single file apps now that will run from just a single executable, so you don't need to worry about packaging all those DLLs up. Speaking of DLLs, there's app trimming. It made an appearance in 3.1, but definitely a lot improved with 5.0. If you've used any front-end frameworks like Webpack or Gulp, you may be familiar with something called tree shaking, where you can, once you build it, you can drop out any CSS or JavaScript that you're not using. So here it can scan and leave out any assemblies or types that you're not using. There's been a lot of nullable reference type annotations, and of course, something that I need to remind myself and others from time to time is that C# is not .NET, as much as C# is a huge part of .NET. F# is a wonderful language, and there's been a lot of great improvements with F# 5, so that's definitely something to look into. So yeah, definitely a lot of stuff you can read up on. Tonight, we're going to talk about C# 9, something near and dear to me. I'm a big fan of a lot of the improvements. Talk about ASP.NET Core and Blazor, and then we've also got a slide to show you about all the Entity Framework Core improvements. They've done so much work with EF Core, so it'll be really nice to see how that works. So first, let's get into C# 9. So C# 9 ships now with .NET 5 and the latest updates with Visual Studio 16.8. So with C# 8, there was a lot of work on nullability. C# 9 has a lot of great improvements. They've done a lot of good things with pattern matching, top-level programs, all that stuff. But I would say if C# 9 had a theme, it was more introducing more immutability and core functional programming concepts. So definitely immutability is not foreign to C#. Strings are immutable, datetimes are immutable, we have link expressions, all that stuff. But I would say that this is probably the biggest release that embraces the concept of immutability. With object-oriented programming, we mimic real-world scenarios, but we're also passing around state and behavior. It's very mutable. We're always having a factor for nulls and all that stuff, and it can lead to a lot of bugs. And there's a lot of advantages to functional programming that we can leverage while still operating under an object-oriented language. So we'll definitely talk about all that good stuff. So we've got lots of great updates. I'm going to focus on 4. So top-level programs, that should say, the consequences of doing slides late at night, target typing, init-only properties, and also records, which is, in my mind, the big feature of C# 9 that everyone's talking about. So with top-level programs, it's a very nice feature which allows you to kind of take away all the ceremony with running apps. You'll see that as every app needs a main method when you're learning to program, it can lead to a lot of confusion, and you can strip all that out, which I'll show in a second. But it's not so much like a syntactic sugar thing. You can do a lot of things. You can do local functions. You can return stuff. You can still work with parameters and arguments as well. So if I show you a top-level program, so let's say I'm a new developer and you're sitting an intern down, or someone like someone in your family that you say, okay, I want you to learn C#. So you say, okay, well, first there's a system import, and now we organize our code and our classes using namespaces. A class is like a blueprint of what you want your objects to be. Then you're explaining to them what static is, why there's a main method, what a string array is, what the args parameter is, and all I want to do is console align to the output. That's all I want to do. And if I'm someone trying to learn things for the first time, I either have to listen to someone say, forget all that stuff. I don't need to worry about that. But if you're trying to learn, you're like, no, I don't want to forget about this stuff. I want to learn about it now. It just makes the barrier to entry a lot harder. So with top level programs, what you can do is you can take out all that. So this is actually a self-executing program. If you look in tools like Sharp Labs out there, ILSpy, all that, you will see that under the covers, it does generate the main method for you, but you are able to use a top level program, and then this will run as is. When I first saw this, I was excited, but not as excited as, seeing this in one line. I don't know if you guys are thinking that, but I thought, ooh, that is really nice, but not as nice as that. So yeah, you're fully qualifying your namespace, but this is actually an executable program using a top level statement. So if I'm learning, I could say, much like I can open a JavaScript file or something and just do console.log, I can do it here, and I can get up and running in a much faster way.
Hey, Dave, there's a
Yeah.
couple questions out here.
Yeah.
The first one is, I'm interested in implications of .NET release cycle, specifically for companies who have a set it and forget it approach of their
Sure.
platform. 3 years is a shorter time to go through and update everything. It might be a bigger question than or maybe it's on the agenda next. That's the theme of the question.
So in terms of 3 years being too short,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that's a valid question. I think they've defined that's how the LTS releases are going to work. I'm not sure if you're wanting a longer support cycle, how that would work. Yeah, that's a good question.
Because I do notice that like .NET 5 is like a short-term release, like a 1 year
Right.
ish, and then
Yep.
6 will be like the longer term one, kind of like 3.1 is right now.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then there's another question. I assume, okay, maybe it's in response to the other one, but I assume it'll work fine like the old Target framework where your app will be set to .NET 5 on a system with .NET 6 installed, and it'll be fine. That's.
Yep. I believe that will all be backwards compatible. Yeah.
Cool. I know there's like a global JSON type of a mechanism where you can pin this project to a specific.
Yeah. So typically in that JSON, you're talking that global.json, by default, it'll take the latest SDK that's installed in your system. But for whatever reason, if you don't want to toggle like a preview release or anything, you can definitely choose that.
Sure. And then now we have another question, and this is related to the current one. So the advantage of a top level program is a couple of less lines of code. That's a question.
Yep. Yeah. I would say that if you look, it definitely makes things a lot easier to work with. But in terms of looking at the output, looking at the IL that is output, that you will still have that. Roslyn will still generate that. But yeah, it does make things a lot easier to see when you're looking at something. But in terms of the benefit, that is definitely valid for sure. So there's a couple other things you can do. So you'll see when you normally have a main method, you take in arguments. So if you're running it from the command line and you want to pass in any flags, you can do that pretty easily. So here you can definitely do that. So it'll just read that in, even though it's not taken as a parameter. You can still use it by in this example, I'm outputting the parameters that I have, so I can still work with these. They're calling them magic arguments. I can still do it from that. So I can write methods. I can call code that will return stuff. All that works. Here I've got a local function here that does some, can remind you of a lot of closures in JavaScript land, but this will compile just fine. So you can definitely get a little advanced with it, or however you're used to doing it. If you're a person that says, hey, there's a main method and I'm fine with doing that, then that's fine. But in terms of getting up and running and stubbing things out, I think a lot of folks are seeing benefits there. So. Another nice feature is target typing. So target typing allows you to get a type from a context on the right side of the equals operator. So, and let me just get something to the I'm just pulling something up here. Okay. So yeah, we're used to, as C# developers, we're probably used to var, where we can implicitly type on the left side, so we can do that on the right now. Of course, it will need to find the type somehow, so you can't do a var on the left and then an implicit target type on the right. I'm still at the stage where it looks weird, but I do really, really like it with collections. So I can show you what I mean by that. So here's the first example here. So I've just got a person. I'm using a constructor, nothing too crazy here. So here you'll see this craziness. So I'm instantiating a new person with a new whatever. I mean, is it really worth saving 6 characters for something that looks that interesting? I don't know. That's definitely up to you. But what I do like is something like this. So if I'm instantiating a collection, then I can just go to town with the with the arguments in the constructor and not have to worry about all that stuff. So this I do like. So this is called target typing. So a nice feature. Like I said, I've seen a lot of people in the community also say, yeah, it works great for collections. Otherwise, I don't know. I don't know the value in it, but I see Rick down there is saying he's literally writing that exact code right now. So not sure which code, but funny stuff as you're discovering C#9. So there's other things like pattern matching and other things, but the big things that I want to talk about are related to immutability in C#9. So the first I would say the first, I don't want to say gateway drug, but I just said it, so I'm going to say gateway drug into immutability in C#9 would be init-only properties. So these are where you can have properties that resemble immutability. So the init keyword prevents you from mutating an object after you initialize it. So the issue with immutability is you could hack it with gets with get only properties in C#8 and whatever, but you could not do it with object initializers. Object initializers are called after the constructor, so there was really no way to achieve that with object initializers. So now you can. And also, if you just want to set properties in an object to be immutable, you can definitely do it there too. So you'll see down there, I've got a blog post on init-only properties. What's a talk without a few shameless plugs, right? So here's how I would typically do stuff with static initializers. So I've got an object here, and instantiating here, then I can just create it, and then I can do the first name here, and then the last name, and I can do this, and I've got a getter and a setter, so I can definitely do it there. So with the main method, now you'll see that if I do a get here, that I'm instantiating a new person, then it'll say, hey, you can't do that. That'll work just fine. So you can do it that way, but you have to use constructors when you're doing it that way. So you definitely need to think about it that way. Now what you'll see here is in this person, I've got a get and a init. So in the init, it allows me to declare it once and only once. So with me noting a first name, Dave, then if I try to instantiate it and set a last name, it will restrict me from doing so. Now I picked only a first name and then called a last name to showcase that these properties are optional, these init properties. So I do not have to have all the properties. That's a nice benefit of object initializers, is that you can just pick and choose in the order you want. It's very flexible in terms of how you do it. But also, you might think that, okay, I initialize this object, but I didn't initialize my property yet. So can I just come in and initialize it whenever I feel like it? The answer is no, that you will definitely have to do it at object instantiation time. So that's the gist of init. So big purpose was with your object initializers, because that was not available in C# 8 as well. So Rick is asking, and it's a common question, how does init differ from read-only? So the real magic is you can do read-only, but once that's set, it'll be locked. With this, gives you the static initializer benefits that they needed here, because there was no way really to achieve immutability with static initializers at all in C# 8 or fewer. So the big, to me anyways, the big feature on C# 9 had to deal with records. So records are, they give you the ability to treat objects as data classes. So meaning, classes are reference types, right? So you have to do a lot of work to look at equality. But if you just want to work with data classes or perform data-like behaviors on properties, you can definitely do it that way. So I've seen a lot of people say, I'm going to keep my object-oriented business, but if I'm working with DTOs or anything like that, I can make those immutable when I'm just reading data back and forth and then pass that on. There's been a lot of people who are rightfully saying, hey, I've already got a data object and it's called a struct. Why don't you guys just build on a struct so that I don't have to add yet another keyword into the C# language? So there's some benefits with records over struct. They're built for immutability. So structs, you can achieve immutability with read-only structs and all that stuff, but it's a lot of work, a lot of boilerplate. So it's basically meant for this purpose with the easy construct. There's support for the I-equatable interface. So you don't have to override anything. You don't have to set up a quality or constructors or deconstructors. It'll do that for you. So there's definitely still a use case for structs, but in terms of basically saying, this is what this is built for, and you don't have to create all this additional boilerplate code to make it work with an object-oriented language. There's a type that actually allows you to do that. So here's a typical hacky, I'm sure buggy version of trying to achieve immutability here. So what I would do is I would either implement a class or a struct or read-only struct or something that would implement that I-equatable, but that means I would have to implement these equals, I would have these gets, this constructor logic, might have to implement a hash code, all that stuff. It works, it might work, but it's just really, really hacky. So if you take this, and I commented out some stuff just because, it just got to be annoying. I'm still looking at 18 lines of code here. So what I can do with the record is I can isolate that down to one line. So if I'm using a constructor, or if I'm using what we call positional arguments, that the I-equatable logic, the immutability, the constructor and deconstructor support all comes with this one line, record person, and then you can note the signature like you always do, and then you can go to town. So definitely a lot cleaner. I think the arguments with your teammates about, is it appropriate to have one type per file? I think those would be over. You could have a lot of DTOs that'll just have a DTO class that'll have all these records if you choose to go down that route. So that's really nice. So there's a lot of nice ways for copying objects as well. So with my apologies for bringing back any Visual Basic nightmares. There is a with keyword, but this actually allows you to copy objects, and then it'll run a copy constructor, and then you can just choose the properties in the objects that you want to change. So like any good dad, I'm going to interject my kids into my examples. So when I create a new person here, that I set that up, and now what I can do is I can say, okay, person has my last name, let me just change it for the first name, that'll include that there. my son as well, I can just include that there. So I can just do these immutable copies of objects, just create a new one, and I don't have to go to all that work to new object, property dot, or copy the object, object 1 equals object 2, that sort of thing. So that is definitely really nice. One thing to talk about, though, there's been a lot of talk about, especially in the .NET doc, it says that records are immutable by default. That's mostly true. So if you wanted to set records up with object initializers, so you would have a group of gets and inits and all that stuff, that is not immutable by default, meaning that if you set a public record, that by itself does not make it immutable if you do not have constructor logic. So if you use the positional constructor format, you get that right away. Otherwise, you'll need to do that get init syntax. So just something to note there. So the big thing is equality here. So it is a reference type, but you can do comparisons, from data, which is really nice. Like I said, if you're working with Entity Framework or DTOs or anything like that. So as you can see here, I've set up a person. So, just set new person, first name, last name, and then I'm using that with logic so that I can copy it and then just change the first name. So obviously this reference equals is going to be false, and the data is also false because Dave does not equal Bob. And if you come to this talk and learn anything, know that there's a difference between Dave and Bob. Now, if I want to make a third object and just say, okay, I want to make a copy of this Bob object, change the first name to Dave, reference equals will clearly be false because they are taking up different allocations. But if you look at the what about data, that will return true. So it truly is, when you do object.equals, it truly is a reference type that does comparison based on data. So they are basically data classes. Any questions on that so far? So you can do construction, deconstruction with tuples. I don't know if it's tuples or tuples, but you can definitely do that. They're better than tuples, I see. So there we go. So yeah, what you can do here is typically, you would have this deconstructor or constructor logic to say, okay, constructors we've likely worked with a bunch of times, right? So we know that we are going to construct an object. But what if I want to just get stuff out without having to do a lot of work? So here I've got here to get the first and last name for my daughter. I can get that out and I don't have to implement anything. That's all contained in that one-liner right there. So I can definitely do that there. It's got to be in order because it's positional, but if you don't want to get anything out of it, you can just do a discard. So kind of like a nothing operator, you could just put an underscore. So if I just wanted to get 3 parameters and have one in the middle, I wouldn't need that too. But the niceness of this is that just imagine all the work you would have to do in the past and deal with immutability. It's right there for you in that one line and gives you all that capability, seeing how terse your classes can be. I do think that this is definitely great, but it kind of makes you wonder, if we're being honest, about what C# is now. Like, people can works out. Records is going to lead to some new and different design patterns that are used that will have to naturally evolve over time. And then, Phil says you can do immutable programming in C#, and records will help with that, but it is still a bit of a chore, if you want to really incorporate it throughout your language. So C# is evolving into more general purpose unopinionated that lets you basically do anything you want. So it's not really opinionated. So it can lead to vastly different code bases despite being written in the same language. It definitely makes identifying the answer, how should I do this, more challenging. You see a lot of new features in C# introduced, and none are being taken away. There's a meme on Twitter going around about the the 7 ways to check if a string is null or empty right now. It's just, it's just an interesting thing to think about how this will evolve, having 2 different paradigms. I think it's a good balance between needing to be backwards compatible and it's not functional first like it is. So this definitely isn't an all or nothing solution. Like if you are not comfortable with using functional paradigms, you don't have to. C# is always backwards compatible, but like I've been saying, records have great use cases for DTO models where you can isolate it from mutable state and behavior in your classes. Definitely, last talk in Madison, there was a guy who was talking about how much he loved it, how much it made the code simpler when working with data and wanting to compare data, and then he could leave the rest of it alone. Yeah. We've got a couple questions. Brian is saying, if you add a parameter to the constructor for a record, does the deconstruction need to be adjusted even if you don't want that value? That's a really good question. I'm not sure. I know that when you do a deconstruction, like with tuples, you can have that discard operator definitely, but I'm not sure if you need to adjust that. You can definitely override it. You can definitely override the deconstruct method as well. Yeah, Rick is. I appreciate not having the Kotlin versus Java debate in the C# space. Yeah, it's. There's certain arguments where, look, if functional programming is so important to me, if I can at least do it a little bit, I might move on to another language. It's kind of like seeing your favorite band evolve as they get more influences. The fact that C# has been able to survive and be so loved as long as it has is that it doesn't mind borrowing from other languages as well. Yeah, mix it in, let the code reviews sort it out. I think a lot of times when you're talking about different code bases looking differently, I think if you've done any programming at all, you see that even when you're in the object-oriented space, you'll see that legacy apps will look completely different as well. So definitely it'll be interesting to see how it works out. I think I'm personally excited for it. I know some people aren't jazzed about it, but you can't be everything to everyone, and I'm really interested to see how this turns out. So, like I said, there's like so much more you could talk about. I mean, there's pattern matching, there's covariant return types, local function attributes, new integer types, module initializers, so much cool stuff. So there's a link down there that has a lot of the nice features. So definitely feel free to check that out. So Charles is asking, can we use a record class in the API post DTOs? Typically, the JSON deserialization, the DTO classes had to have public properties. I don't see why you wouldn't if you're just translating an object from your domain layer to the DTO layer. If you're doing post to update the existing record, obviously not, but I don't think having the public properties would be that big. If you do want to do that though, to keep them public and to have the the gets and sets in there, then you would need to do the gets, the get init structure there. Do we have? No problem, Charles. Do we have any other questions before we move on to Blazor? Because if I'm talking about .NET, I have to talk about Blazor. It is all the hype. Cool. So yeah, there's definitely from the website, from the ASP.NET Core side. So we just talked about high level C# stuff, but people are really excited about Blazor. I've been experimenting with it when it was just this cute project 2 years ago that might see the light of day, and now it's evolved into something that's production ready. Being able to see C# in the browser is still cool when I open DevTools. So for those of you who aren't on the train yet or haven't dove into it too much, there's two different flavors of Blazor. So there's the WebAssembly version, so it loads the .NET runtime in your browser, and you have an initial hit when you're loading your app, but otherwise it's relatively okay, even if it is a little heavy. Otherwise, there's Blazor Server. So if you have an API and you want to share models, or if you want if you want some flexibility there, you can have a server-side API, server-side Blazor that will talk to your Blazor app. That is done over a persistent SignalR connection. So there will be a call for every interaction that they have. But you've got Blazor across the stack, right? So you've got a lot of houses that are dev houses that are saying, we've got this convoluted JavaScript tooling, we've got C# devs, we don't have a lot of JavaScript expertise in our organization. This is nice because we have one tool chain to do C# across the stack with our native tooling. So that definitely has a lot of benefits there. So it is seeing the light of day. So in terms of ASP.NET Core in general, it definitely has record type support. So obviously, having records in C#9 is great. Integrating it into ASP.NET Core is great as well. There's open API specs and Swagger F5 support. So you're probably familiar with Swagger UI. It's the ability to download a swashbuckle package where it'll render a swagger.json file that describes your API, all the gets, posts, required fields, all that good stuff. Traditionally, you would have to download that NuGet package yourself. It would be a pretty big pain. Now, unless you tell them otherwise, it'll do that for you. So then when you hit F5, your Swagger page will open instead of a blank, lonely white page. So that is definitely nice. I think a big driver for this is that Azure API Management will now do a publish step in Visual Studio for that, so that's great. There's a new Azure AD security library. JSON extension methods have been added and are faster, and there's been a lot of movement on making Blazor not only a good SPA framework for traditional .NET devs to make them develop faster, but actually providing the capabilities that basically come from a React or an Angular for what you would expect. And one thing that you would definitely expect from a framework like that is instant feedback, which is a great draw of front-end development. So I can click save, my page will reload, I can just iterate so fast. So that has been integrated with .NET Watch. .NET Watch has been around a while, but now you can do it with Blazor for auto refresh. So there's been a few great things with .NET 5 in Blazor. The ones I want to talk about are CSS isolation. I actually got really curious and ended up writing the Microsoft doc for it, so that was fun. Component virtualization and also lazy loading. So a big problem with devs and trying to work on a project of any size is dealing with CSS. And obviously the C in CSS is cascading, but you're definitely going to see a lot of issues when you're dealing with, say, Bootstrap or Tailwind. You're using with your custom styles. You're dealing with CSS bleed, where you're meaning to style one element, but it styles the entire page, and it can get in this, in this web dev world, it can get very confusing really fast. And with Blazor, the way that it works with components, you've got components that are made for reusability. So if I can't reuse my components completely, where I have to style CSS separately, it makes it a little bit difficult. So let's just start with a simple style, just to keep this simple. So apart from you judging me that I'm using Comic Sans in a presentation, I think we can all agree that if I put this in my site.css, that all of our H1s will be in Comic Sans. Nice to get a thumbs up from Jason. So I guess I'll know that Jason wrote an app when I see Comic Sans, right? So if I style it in an H1, then I see if I'm new to CSS or something, and I know this example is really simple. I know that, okay, everything will be in Comic Sans. All the H1s for all my components will be in Comic Sans. So next, what I do is I say, okay, I'm just gonna make this H1 on this component. I'll just give it a class, my heading for my page. So only that will be Comic Sans. And then by the end of the day, you're dealing with, oh, something in a library that I'm using is using that style. It bundles into my site CSS. And by the time you're doing that, you're telling all your devs to never use important, and then you look two ways, and then you're like, I'm just going to use important because I need to ship this feature, right? So it gets to be very confusing and very problematic. So the problem here is component-specific styles that you just want to have isolated can cause bloat, confusion, and issues. If you see at this right here, in Chrome DevTools, you have the ability to basically look at what stuff isn't being used. So what I did is I set all the styles, and for one component, I have 62% unused bytes. So it's not even using all that, but it's loading all that. So it's not very performant either. So there's hope to have a way to scope styles to your components only. The CSS isolation GitHub issue from Microsoft was created by an Angular dev who said, hey, I love Blazor so much, but this is, you don't understand until you do this, that it's so life-changing that I don't have to worry, all that stress is all gone, that we really would like this. So it's one of the most popular features that was requested. So, so how do you do this? So it is, I should reiterate that much like C#9 records or whatever else, there's no performance hit if you don't do this. It's not a NuGet package, it is built in, but unless you create a styles.css file, it will not, you will not be using CSS isolation. So what you do here is you create a file called mycomponent.styles.css, and when you do that in Visual Studio, you'll see that it'll be nested under your component. And then those styles will only be scoped to your component. So the nice thing is that you could name that an H1, and you can have an H1 in another component, and they're not going to collide. So it is a build step, though. So when we talk about instant feedback, a lot of it is I can make a CSS change, save it, and it'll be done. Now, with .NET Watch, it's not a very long time, but it will take a couple seconds to do that. Why it's doing that is that it's rewriting CSS on the fly. But it is good because what you can do is you can configure your project. So if I'm using Webpack or Sass or any preprocessors, you can use that before the build happens. So you can definitely integrate. I can use Sass, use variables with my CSS, and it'll all be integrated seamlessly. There's some people who are a little concerned that they don't have native preprocessor support, but I think in terms of them endorsing what kind of preprocessors and how to do that, it's more of a, hey, bring your tools and you'll be fine. So you're probably wondering, how does this magic even work? Like, it's not going to collide, but as a developer, I want to know how this magic works. Well, first of all, it really isn't magic. So they've borrowed a lot of good paradigms for how Vue does things. So what Blazor does is it appends a scope identifier to your attributes and then bundles that all up in a project-specific bundle. So it says, okay, this B dash, so by default, these scopes are prefaced by B. I'm pretty sure I know what that B stands for. So this do 6BV correlates to that component that you specified, and then a list of all your styles for your projects will be output to a bundle. So before RC2, it was the entire project, but now it's, or the entire solution, but now it's your project. So if you would look into the footer of an HTML, so your rendered HTML, you right-click to inspect element. Then at the bottom, you'll see link href myproject.styles.css. I hope that you name your project a little better than I do, but just to show you that that is scoped to the project. So here you'll see, and what I do really like is if you want to do some sleuthing or some debugging, they comment out the component that it's referencing, so I don't have to know, hey, B-3XX. Oh, of course, that's my counter page. So you'll see all that stuff there. So so yeah, that is definitely really nice, and that ensures that it will isolate things appropriately. Now, you're probably wondering, you know, I might have child components. So I've got a component that calls child1, that has a child1 component, that has a component. So by default, it will only apply to the component in question that you supply the razor.styles CSS for, but you can wire this up as well. So there's this deep, I believe it's a combinator, there's a deep selector. So what that will do is that will say, okay, for every H1, go down the tree, and anything that is a child of this also apply to it as well. So if you can see here that we've got a div here, and then this H1 is appended, so that knows that anything under that will be applied as well. So you can definitely use this example and supply it to child components. So I'm a big fan of this feature. I think it makes things a lot easier. I've spent, I don't even want to know how many hours of my life just, someone comes to my desk, is your item done yet? Like, I don't know. I've been spending 7 hours wondering why my CSS, isn't working. I feel like it's been a lot of confusion. It's just, how the modern web is these days. It can be very convoluted. So I think this really helps, just takes the mental energy out of it. So I'm a big fan of this feature. A next question that you might have, I'm not going to talk about it, but CSS isolation is great. What about JavaScript isolation? Yes, there is JavaScript isolation. There is Razor class library support. So that provides you the ability to basically package up a component, and you can just pass it along. So now when you pass along a component, it will have the styles, it will have the isolation for both JavaScript and CSS. So definitely good stuff there. Another good feature that I like is component virtualization. So that actually allows you to limit the UI rendering to the visible page elements only. So if you have a table with thousands of rows, I know you would never intentionally list a table with 7,000 rows, but there's a lot of desire to have these unlimited scrolling type pages where you could see a scenario where you're getting data back from an API, and whether or not you paginate it, it can be very cumbersome, and then you can start to see some latency. Blazor is pretty zippy, but you can definitely notice that if you've got a big table that it will be pretty slow. So what you can do with component virtualization is you can limit that to the visible page only, and then as you scroll, it will keep rendering, so it'll be in memory, but it'll only paint what it sees. So here's something that basically prefaces Blazor other than the code block, right? You've got this, the great thing about having a first example to be slow is it was just fun, because I could just write terrible code, and if it wasn't slow enough, I would write more terrible code. And I found I did some great terrible code. I made 10,000 cars. I had a for loop just to iterate through everything. I didn't even have a for each. It was just like I had a thread. It was just atrocious. So what I did is I did this, and then here what I do is a for each. So I iterate through my 10,000 cars that I made, and boy was it slow. It was just lagging. So I wanted to see how that worked, and it was really slow. So what I can do now is, this is actually a pre-baked component that's called virtualize. So now instead of doing that big for each loop that we all know about, I can pass an items provider. So that items provider is basically saying, what are you giving me? So I'm doing this load cars. So that's the method I'm calling to load all those cars. And then that car is an instance of that. So now I can do ID, name, and cost. And what's also nice is while you're loading that table, you don't need to do a lot of what you've probably done in Blazor, where you say that if cars equals null, say loading, else load this. There's a placeholder attribute. So you can just have that. The placeholder is nested in the virtualized component, and you can have that while you're loading all your cars. So what it's doing is it's actually looking at the viewport, and then it's showing the height of that, and then it's actually rewriting as you scroll. So I've actually got a video here, and what I'd like you to do, the top is pretty boring. I'm scrolling through, but as you can see, what we're going to see is the height of the viewport is adjusting, and then I'm going to expand these TR tags, these row tags, and you'll see that they change as I scroll. Yeah, so as I scroll here, you'll see that the height of the viewport is changing. And then if I go to the TR, you'll see that this is rewriting as I scroll. So it is in memory, but it just, you can see that it's a lot smoother experience. This was a 10,000 row table, and it's definitely a lot smoother than I was accustomed to. So you can do a lot more with this and not just have rows in memory. So imagine you're calling an API that you don't own, and the API is going to return a bunch of rows. You can actually have these delegates that you can call that will say, okay, I want to return 15 items here, and then when I get 15, call the API again. So you can actually see, if you do this, if you go into DevTools, you can see that the API calls keep hitting. And you can also configure lazy loading to only return a certain amount of items. So yeah, it's great for external APIs. You can definitely have a lot of fun there. So definitely a great feature if you're seeing a lot of latency with what you're displaying. And yes, it does work with the stream as well. I have seen a lot of, there's been some activity on GitHub where people are seeing that it's not very consistent. So it doesn't work very well if your viewport changes a lot. So if you've got divs nestled up against each other that have these images or that change frequently, it's the viewport's got to be more or less static. Otherwise, it's hard for it to determine because it needs to calculate the size of it. So definitely, it's not like a dumping ground of, okay, I think this table might be slow, so why don't I just throw a virtualized component around it? Because you might, if your viewport is flexible with its width, it might be different. But for the right scenario, I think it is really great. A big request with Blazor was lazy loading as well. So lazy loading, like Entity Framework or any of the other things you do, where you don't return everything right away, only when you need them. So in this project file, I can actually include the DLL. So say I've got a splash page, right? And then I've got all these links in my page. So for each page, I can say, okay, only load the DLLs when that page is rendered. So that definitely is very nice, especially for the stuff that is pretty expensive. So you can do a lot of things. You can include in the project file. You can set up the routing here. So there's these on navigate async. Async calls that you can do, but it is here. I haven't worked with it a lot, so I've just got the one slide devoted to it, but it is a super nice feature. Once your assemblies are loaded, they are loaded. It's not like when you navigate from a page that it'll be gone, but in terms of that initial load, it'll help speed that up. Obviously, with WebAssembly, there's a lot of network calls, and AOT is ahead of time compilation will be coming with .NET 6, but obviously with loading the whole framework, there's still some performance considerations, so that will definitely help as you do that. So before I wrap up, I do feel a little bad to only devote one slide to Entity Framework Core because they've done a lot of great work, but there's a lot of good stuff that has come out from Entity Framework Core 5. I've got the announcement in the bit.ly link below. So if you do use Entity Framework, many-to-many support, I think by far that was a huge one. So typically with many-to-many support, if you're linking tables with relationships, you would need a join table, much like when you're doing like an inner join statement. Now you don't have to do that. It can do that implicitly. You can do things like simple logging. So you can add logging to log your queries. You can actually make calls to get the query. So it's definitely gotten better throughout the years, but I know being able to see what Entity Framework generates, the raw SQL query, has been a big feature, so we can see what's actually happening under the hood. If you've got expensive includes, you can split those now into multiple queries, and table per type was a pretty big one too. So previously you had an inheritance hierarchy that mapped types to a single table. Now you can map them to a different database table. Definitely it can carry some performance considerations, but it is supported there. So definitely, happy to stick around, answer any questions. I'm on Twitter in the footer there if you have any questions. I'd really like to know how .NET 5 works for you. And the .NET Conf was last week, which had all this stuff and much more. So I've got a bit.ly link here. that has a playlist of all the videos there. So yeah, that's your basic crash course. Do you have any questions? So I see Ian's bringing me back to the Blink days with HTML. Yeah, I was, as a 14-year-old, my first web page had Blink, and I was really sad when that was no more. I think it's professional, but you know. And then Rick's talking about the from raw SQL is definitely very useful if you run into the aggregate issue for sure. Yeah, I definitely think the output SQL is a lot better, but it's always good to know what's happening under the hood with a simple call.
Yeah.
That was a big issue of what was introduced on the last NA framework in 3.1, maybe it might have been 2.2, where if you had an aggregate function, you had to explicitly do as enumerable, which means you're pulling all the data down anyways.
Oh man.
Which is what it was actually doing before that. It didn't give you a warning that that's what it was doing. But when with the 5.0 stuff, you have that from raw SQL, and so you can actually you still write it like a normal link statement, and it returns a collection. It's strongly typed and everything. It's just you can tell it the explicit SQL. So if you need to do some crazy like partitioning, aggregation, anything that there's no chance that the any framework is going to be able to translate for you, you can use raw SQL to get the output you need without the performance impact of pulling everything local.
Nice. Yeah, they've definitely. I think they've definitely made a lot of improvements. There's been the ASP.NET stand-ups all the time, but now the EF team has stand-ups where they're definitely taking community feedback. So that's definitely a very, very good thing. So I see Paul has a question. Who should be targeting the .NET 5? Given the release schedule, it seems like anything built on .NET 5 will need to be updated and released between November 2021 and February 2022. So it seems tempting to wait to .NET 6. Yeah. So if you're really cognizant of your performance and you feel that your performance is then has been just refined from your end, and you want to take advantage of serialization improvements on some really big performant apps, that would be one thing. If you're wanting to adopt Blazor and a lot of the quality of life developer improvements, that would be great. If you're in an org where you think the perf improvements would be nice, but you know that you will upgrade soon, that's great. Otherwise, people might be very comfortable to waiting for .NET 6. But I would say to Ian's point here, there is a lot of performance that has been done with serialization and buffers and all that stuff. So you'll definitely see a benefit there if you upgrade. If not, .NET 6 will be a year from now with that LTS tag. Yep, definitely gRPC updates. Networking updates. Yeah, I see a lot of blogs where people are talking about 20 to 30% improvements. So if performance is a big consideration for you, then it might be worth a shot.